It is 10 GMT. I'm Foli Batibo, live at Al Jazeera headquarters in Doha. We have breaking news this hour out of Geneva, where the UN's extrajudicial executions investigator, Agnes Callamard, has just released a report that paints a damning picture of Saudi Arabia's role in the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The responsibility for the murder is clear and an international investigation is needed. The report calls the death inside the Turkish consulate in Istanbul last October an extrajudicial killing for which Saudi Arabia is responsible. Agnes Callamard calls for further investigation of the individual responsibility of Saudi officials at the highest level, including Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The report details taped conversations about body disposal in the moments before Khashoggi's arrival at the consulate. Callamard says the killing is an international crime with universal jurisdiction and urges a criminal inquiry by the United Nations. Well, we have two reporters standing by with more on this breaking news story. Hashim Ahelbara is in Istanbul, where, as you'll recall, Jamal Khashoggi was murdered. But first to our diplomatic editor, James Bays at the United Nations. James, a much anticipated report which you've seen and studied. Tell us more about what it says and how damning is it for Saudi Arabia?
Well, it took her 5 months. She was also consulting some top experts around the world, the Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killing, Agnes Callamard. She decided to set up this inquiry under her own mandate. After 5 months, there are 101 pages. She said she's taken the decision to name all the names. For example, this is the 15-person Saudi team that she said went to Istanbul. It is a damning report. It's a report that is pretty certain of who is to blame. She says Saudi Arabia is responsible for premeditated murder. It completely blows away the official Saudi cover story that this was a botched plan to seize Mr. Khashoggi and take him back to Saudi Arabia. She details in her report that there were conversations when he first visited the consulate 4 days before he was murdered to inquire about documentation to get married. As soon as he visited the consulate, the phone calls were made from the consulate to Riyadh to inform them that he'd been there, and already they were talking about dispatching a team. Then when it gets to the day of the actual murder, that is when the really damning conversation takes place between the forensic doctor who'd arrived with the rest of the team, the 15-man team that had come from Riyadh, and Mahir Mutreb, another member of the team, quite possibly the leader of the team, who is a security official who has often accompanied Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi Crown Prince. In that conversation, they talk about putting the trunk in a bag, whether it will be too heavy. They talk about separating joints, and they talk about bringing plastic and leather bags in which to place the body. As a result of that conversation, she says, the interception of Mr. Khashoggi was the result of a planned and elaborate mission involving extensive coordination and resources. Then there is some passages in this, having listened, and she did listen to some of the tapes from Turkish intelligence that really are very distressing, describing the actual moment of the murder.
That was going to be my question to you, actually. The next question is, what materials, what evidence did she have, Agnes Callamard, to gather this report, to come up with these results?
Well, it's listening, I think, to those recordings. We've all heard about those recordings, but we've not really had much detail of exactly what is in all of those recordings that were gathered by Turkish intelligence. She makes it clear she didn't hear all of the recordings and she wasn't given the recordings. She was allowed to listen to them, but she wasn't allowed to keep them. And she only heard 45 minutes of what she believes to be 7 hours of recordings that Turkish intelligence have. Despite that, it's really very chilling information. She says that sounds of a struggle can be heard, and then the words, "Did he sleep?" keep pushing. She talks about sounds of movement and heavy panting could be heard. The sound of plastic sheets could also be heard. Pretty clear, though, from the descriptions she gives, the detailed descriptions, that they had planned to murder him. There was no shock, she says, at the fact that he had died. So that, I think, clearly blows away the official Saudi narrative of what happened in the consulate on the 2nd of October.
As you say, pretty chilling information, especially about how Jamal Khashoggi's body was disposed of. But we still don't know where his remains are.
No, and she doesn't give us new information about that. She also does not make a direct link. She doesn't have direct evidence that this was ordered by the Saudi Crown Prince. But she says that there is lots of circumstantial information that Mr. Khashoggi was fully aware of the powers held by the Crown Prince and fearful of him. He was worried that he could be kidnapped and returned to Saudi Arabia. She says the operation against Mr. Khashoggi has to be understood in relation to this organised and coordinated crackdown, one that included repeated unlawful acts of torture and physical harm. She goes on, at a bare minimum, the Crown Prince condoned this behaviour and allowed the repetition and escalation of these crimes. So even if she doesn't have proof of the Crown Prince directly ordering this, she says he created a campaign, and this was part of that campaign.
And James, so then what recommendations does she make in this report, and what happens next?
Well, I think it's worth telling you that the UN has been dragging its feet, seriously dragging its feet, on whether to launch an investigation into this. And she has used her mandate, which comes to her from the Human Rights Council as an investigator on extrajudicial killings all around the world, to focus on this one and set up her own inquiry, using really the limits of her mandate. She now makes it clear that the rest of the UN needs to do its bit. And she makes very strong recommendations both to the Secretary-General and the Security Council. She says to the Secretary-General that he needs to initiate a follow-up criminal investigation into the killing of Mr. Khashoggi. Now, he has said, and certainly there are many legal scholars who don't agree with him on this, that he can only do that if he has one of the major bodies of the United Nations. So the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, or the UN Human Rights Council asking him to do that, or a member state, perhaps, Turkey asking to do that. She says no, he should himself be able to establish an international follow-up without the trigger by any state. So the ball very much in the court of Antonio Guterres and other organs of the United Nations. She says they have the power, they must investigate.
We'll see what happens after this report is released. James Spays at the United Nations.